come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad, and then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
전체의 사회 주의를 우리 어떻게 정대로 지키는가를 세계여보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 장군님 배승의 영도 따라서 선군의 붉은 기 그 신념으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 조체의 강중대국을 우리 어떻게 이 땅에 세우는가를 세계여보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 장군님의 뜻을 받들어 불굴의 정신력 그대 장으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. Ялтин дарагетте боцима
Vietnam brûle et moi je hurle Mao, Mao. Johnson rigole et moi je vole Mao, Mao. Le napalm coule et moi je roule Mao, Mao. Les villes crèvent et moi je rêve Mao, Mao. Les putains crient et moi je ris Mao, Mao. Le riz est fou et moi je joue Mao, Mao.
C'est le petit livre rouge qui fait que tout enfin bouge.
L'impérialisme dicte partout sa loi. La révolution n'est pas un dîner. La bomba est un tigre en papier. Les masses sont les véritables héros. Les ricains tuent et moi je mue Mao, Mao. Les fous sont rois et moi je bois Mao, Mao. Les bombes tonnent et moi je sonne Mao, Mao. Les bébés fuient et moi je fuis Mao, Mao. Les Russes mangent et moi je danse Mao, Mao. Diable dénonce, je renonce Mao, Mao.
C'est le petit livre rouge qui fait que tout enfin bouge.
La base de l'armée, c'est le soldat. Le vrai pouvoir est au bout du fusil. Les monstres seront tous anéantis. L'ennemi ne périt pas de lui-même. Mao, Mao. Mao, Mao. Mao, Mao. Mao, Mao.
When I was young, I used to be as fine a man as ever you'd see at the Prince of Wales. He said to me, come and join the British Army. Tooraloo, they're looking for monkeys up at the zoo. It says, one, if I had a face like you, I'd join the British Army. Sarah Connon baked a cake and so for poor old Slattery sake, sure I threw myself into the lake pretending I was barmy. Tooraloo, I've made me mind up what to do. Now I'll work me ticket home to you and the British Army. Sergeant Healy went away and his wife got in the family way, and the only words that she could say was blame the British Army. Tooraloo, me curse upon the Labour Blue that took me darling boy from me to join the British Army. Corporal Sheen is a terrible note, just give him a couple of jars of stout and he beat the enemy with his mouth and saved the British Army. Tooraloo, I've made me mind up what to do. Now I'll work me ticket home to you and the British Army.
Ich trage eine Fahne und diese Fahne ist rot. Es ist die Arbeiterfahne, die Vater trug durch die Not. Die Fahne ist niemals gefallen, so oft auch der Träger fiel. Sie weht heute über uns allen und zieht schon der Sehnsucht Ziel. Ich trage eine Fahne, das Rot der Arbeiter macht. Es hat die Arbeiterfahne bei Nacht mein Vater bewacht und hat sie mir früh übergeben, als Morgenrot stieg empor, dass wir sie zur Sonne geben, bei Tag in der Kampf beschworen. Ich trage eine Fahne und diese Fahne ist rot. Es ist die Arbeiterfahne, die uns die
мы березу, разовьем мы кудряву. Ой, да-дай-да, ой, да-дай-да, разовьем мы кудряву.
Утреннего в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжается бой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весь летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
Продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно грузит. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный отцом впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный отцом впереди. И весной снегопад, и ветер пока. Продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно грузит. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный отцом впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный отцом продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно грузит. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный отцом впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный отцом впереди.
دا وطن 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 دا دل افغان وطن دا پمونګ ګران وطن دا پمونګ ګران وطن دا پمونګ ګران وطن خاور د غیرت د زلزلې لري طوفان
Hello, everybody, and welcome along. This is the second episode in our ongoing series, Debunking Anti-Communist Frauds. And of course, there is perhaps no bigger anti-communist fraud, and though that is a title for which there will be an awful lot of competition. But one of the biggest frauds, and one of the biggest liars, and one of the biggest, let's be quite crude here, criminal pieces of garbage is, of course, a certain Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a man whose reputation is based on a series of lies, who was always a deep reactionary, who benefited from the largesse and generosity of the Khrushchev period, and who was lauded in his 20-year-long exile in Vermont in the United States for telling a gigantic series of lies and wild exaggerations, and also for urging on the US imperialists to take as hostile and rabid a position possible against the land he claimed to, of course, love so much. But we will get into what Mr. Solzhenitsyn actually liked and what he was in reality. Did he truly love the Russia that he spoke so much about? Or is he a man merely dedicated to maintaining bourgeois property relations? Now, the figure of Solzhenitsyn these days, particularly for the younger generation, those born really since the 90s, or particularly those born since the 2000s, might not know a great deal about who this guy was. But he was a serious figure in the intellectual circle of anti-communist Russians in the what used to be referred to as the white Russian community in the United States. Solzhenitsyn was a big deal back in the 70s and early 80s. Again, always urging on the US imperialists to take the most rabidly hostile position possible against the Soviet Union. And by examining Solzhenitsyn and his claims and his career, we can tell an awful lot about anti-communism, particularly in the form that it is practiced in the United States and Britain and Western Europe. Now, Solzhenitsyn, let's first examine what the man's professed beliefs were. Now, it is my contention throughout this series that when we look at what anti-communists accuse us communists of doing, what we actually get is a large element of, in fact, a gigantic element of projection. And so, one of the things that communists from, well, Marx on down, but certainly Lenin, Stalin, Mao, are accused of is being willing to sacrifice gigantic amounts of the population, of the proletariat and the peasantry, of Russia and the Soviet Union, of China, name a country. The anti-communists will accuse us of wanting to sacrifice millions upon millions in pursuit of a mad idea that can never be realized. That's one of the things that we will run into time and time again when we're talking about anti-communists. But of course, you peel back the layers of this propaganda and you'll find that this does not apply to the likes of Stalin or Lenin or Mao or Castro or Ho Chi Minh or Kim Il-sung. What you find when you actually examine the reality of life in the Soviet Union, life in the People's Republic of China, Vietnam, the DPRK, Cuba, is that, of course, after the revolution, for all the gigantic sacrifices the proletariat and the peasantry made, that life there improved enormously for the masses. It was, of course, for the landlords and capitalists that life got worse, and it is their narrative that is reflected in the anti-communist literature and official ideology of the imperialist countries. Solzhenitsyn actually personifies the very thing that we are told that we communists are guilty of. He is a man, or was a man, though I think we can talk about him in the present tense because his foul and rotten legacy still lingers. Solzhenitsyn is a man, a figure, who was exactly what, as I say, the anti-communists accuse us of being. He is a man who was willing to sacrifice and utterly destroy or call for the nation he always ranted and raved about loving so much and wanting to protect it against the communists and the Jews. Well, Solzhenitsyn was willing to sacrifice that most crucial element of the Russian nation, that of its people. He was willing to, of course, cheer on, first from afar and then up close and personal, the absolute destruction of the Russian nation and its subordination for over a decade to US imperialism as part of the counter-revolution. That is what the great nationalist, the great lover of the Russian people, Solzhenitsyn, was cheering on and was very enthusiastic about. Now, Solzhenitsyn said over and over again that there is this the Russian nation, which is holy and sacred, and then there is this awful thing called communism, which is a disease that has infected the Russian nation. And therefore, in his view, any cure that would get rid of that disease was worth it. But let us examine this for a moment and go into the very boring realm which an absurd reactionary fantasist like Solzhenitsyn would not like to go into. That is the realm, of course, of the actual real life of the Russian proletariat and peasantry. Now, Solzhenitsyn always had a gigantic contempt for the Russian peasant and the Russian worker, all the way through to the end of his wretched life. And that goes for the great majority, in fact, it goes for all of the exiled anti-communist ex-Soviet types. What you find in all of them is that they all had a contempt and a loathing, a class-based loathing for the Soviet worker and the Soviet peasant. And this was part of what drove their anti-communism. Now, the case of Solzhenitsyn, of course, is that he had and stood for and propagated this idea of this romantic, monarchical, autocratic Christian Russia, which of course was something that was based in the realm of fantasy. Now, Solzhenitsyn, following on from the anti-communists and of the early period of the Soviet Union, and following on from them, he would make claims such as that the Bolsheviks were a foreign imposition, a Jewish imposition. That was one of his things, of course. I don't expect the liberals who admire him so much to talk about that these days. That communism was a foreign imposition from outside, but of course it was not. Of course, this is mythology from Solzhenitsyn and others. Solzhenitsyn joins others of his ilk in accusing the Bolsheviks of being tools of the Germans. And that, again, like, this is a complete case of projection, because it was Solzhenitsyn's beloved monarchy and the Russian bourgeoisie who, both in the pre-revolutionary period and later after the counter-revolution, turned Russia into, of course, a neo-colony later on of the US and the British and the Western Europeans. In the later 19th and early 20th century, the British and the French in particular were the masters of the Russian bourgeois and ultimately of the Russian absolutism. It is they who called the shots. It is they who had, if not complete control over the Russian state under the autocracy of Nicholas II. And then they had a very strong influence over it. It is they that sought to push the Russian bourgeois, who didn't need much pushing, and the Russian Tsardom into World War I, wanting to use the Russian peasantry, the Russian peasant soldiery, as essentially bullet sponges to take a good portion of the German army away from the Western Front. That was your monarchy. That was the beloved monarchy of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and that was the Russian pre-revolutionary Russian bourgeois. They were slaves of British and French imperialism. They were people they were a class and an autocracy sitting on the top of it, who were completely owned by foreign capital, completely owned by it. So the likes of Solzhenitsyn and his claims about Russian nationhood, blah, and all the sort of blah blah he would give it. Again, this is complete mythology. What Solzhenitsyn was defending in reality was the privileges of a class that he aspired to belong to, the privileges of a Russian elite that would lord it over the working class and the peasantry. That is what Solzhenitsyn fundamentally wanted, and it's why he was arrested for anti-Soviet activities as a result of having his correspondence intercepted during the Great Patriotic War. It's why he was justifiably imprisoned in the Stalin era and unjustifiably released in the Khrushchev era. And the man's later antics running around the United States making all kinds of claims that were untrue about the Soviet Union only goes to show what a miserable wretch he really was. This man, along with all the other Russian counter-revolutionaries, was prepared to see the nation enslaved again, simply in order that he could receive what he thought was his proper place within it. That's your anti-communists. That's your anti-communist intellectuals. He's no better than the wretches that are running Ukraine right now. If it had been left in the hands of Solzhenitsyn, then what you would get in Russia would be a version of what you're getting now in Ukraine, which is essentially like a Russian fascism, which is wholly subservient to US, British, French, and German capital. That's the dream that Solzhenitsyn ultimately had. And the current Russian governing group and their admiration for him is something that we should address, and we will do so later on in the program. But if you've ever been on a demonstration, as I have, marching with my party comrades of the CPGBML, I did a march through London with the comrades on May Day of last year. We were carrying, of course, as we always do, on these big occasions, the banners showing the portraits of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin in particular always gets a lot of attention, and he always gets some ill-informed fool staggering past you shouting 80 million dead. Now, we did this time. Now, where does the 80 million figure come from? Well, we turn to, of course, a certain Mr. Solzhenitsyn. Now, Solzhenitsyn came up with various different figures as to who was killed or how many died, how many excess deaths there were. His story varied between 57 million and 66 million sometimes, 80 million sometimes. So these are figures come up with that are come up with by Solzhenitsyn. Some of which he just plucked out of thin air. So the thing to look at here is of course these claims have to be stacked against the actual reality of the increase in the Soviet population. Now, the population of the Soviet Union continued to consistently increase year on year after the coming to power of the Bolsheviks and the end of the Civil War, all the way through to the collapse in 1991. It had its ups and its downs. There was the period where population growth actually leveled off was, of course, the Great Patriotic War. And again, this is a case of an anti-communist like Solzhenitsyn ultimately engaging in a case of projection. The population across all of the Soviet states consistently grew for the entire period of the Soviet Union. And so that gives lie, of course, to the Ukrainian fascists and make all their claims about the Holodomor. We will be coming back to the Holodomor lie in future episodes and covering something of Mr. Trotsky's role within it. Now, so then how is it the case that if there were 80 million, as Solzhenitsyn claimed at one point, excess deaths in the Soviet Union, how was it the case then that the population increased each year in terms of in all of the states of the Union, and it only stopped increasing and in fact fell off a cliff when the counter-revolution was carried through? This is of course something that does not make sense, but you're not supposed to think about it. Solzhenitsyn and others would make these wild claims and publish these gigantic numbers. Nobody would ever ask them for proof in the West. Solzhenitsyn could go around and speak to various different US universities, speak to Congress about like all the enormous numbers that he claimed to that the Soviet Union, both in the Stalin period and after, had killed. He was making it up. The woman who was his wife at the time of his death later confirmed that he was making an awful lot of this stuff up. So I am indebted to one correspondent who is a regular viewer of the program, Svetlana, a Russian comrade, I think based in Moscow. And I thank her for sending me this message the other day, because of course though I can read bits of Russian, my spoken Russian is almost non-existent, and my Russian comprehension is nowhere near what it would need to be to understand our interviews. So what I was sent by our comrade in Russia is a very interesting piece, a very interesting revelation, and I again thank her for sending this through. So the ultimate source of the numbers for Solzhenitsyn's claims comes from a man named Ivan Alexeyevich Kurganov, which apparently is pronounced Kurganov. Now, Kurganov was born with the name Ivan Koshkin, and he was an officer serving in the White Army under a certain Admiral Kolchak. Now, if you're not familiar with who Admiral Kolchak was, he was the wannabe military dictator of Russia. He was a pure servant of imperialism, and what they had in mind for a dedicated servant such as Kolchak was that he would run Russia essentially as a military dictator, and he would essentially reduce the entire population of the old Russian Empire to abject slavery and run that country on behalf of British, French, and ultimately US imperialism. That's what the white generals were into. And those who had the misfortune to visit the areas that the white generals actually ran, even people who weren't pro-Bolshevik, observed that these people instituted an immediate system of out-and-out slavery when it came to the peasants and the workers. So that's who the white generals were. And Ivan Koshkin, later Kurganov, was a man who served in the White Army under Kolchak. He later managed to get out of imprisonment and only spent 5 months in a camp, and then was released because of the fact that he ultimately came from a peasant family. Now, in the manner of these things, he actually did quite well in the Soviet Union. He got a doctorate in economics and became a preeminent economist in the USSR. And of course, he remained depending upon which view you want to take, he remained either an undercover anti-communist this entire time, or an opportunist and a careerist who took every opportunity he could to proclaim his loyalty to the winning team. Either way, a revolting individual. When the Great Patriotic War started, he was captured by the occupying German forces and immediately started collaborating with them. He was later taken to work for the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, and Korganov, as he was then named, became a dedicated servant to the Third Reich's occupation of Soviet Russia. So again, Korganov became a propagandist for the fascists. He became a propagandist for the people who were enslaving and murdering the Soviet peoples. And later, he was captured at the end of the war by the Soviet authorities, but managed to escape and was ultimately smuggled over to the USA by, of course, our old friends, the American imperialists. And according to our Russian correspondent, Korganov then went into exile in the United States and was such a rabid anti-communist that even other white Russians considered him to be too much of a fascist. And he dedicated himself to a study of Soviet demographics, supposedly. And Korganov is the one who makes the claim that the population collapsed by as much as it did between 1917 and 1959, and that in this period that the population that Russia had lost 110,700,000 people due to a fall in the birth rate, war, and communist repression. The communist repression, apparently, he said it was responsible for 55 million deaths. This fiction, this story, was published in a Russian exile newspaper in 1964. It was published in a Russian exile newspaper called Novoye Rusko Slovo, New Russian Word, apparently. Again, I am indebted to my correspondent for the translation now. So, Korganov published this claim that the population had, that Russia had lost 110,700,000 people in 42 years, and that the birth rate had collapsed. Well, again, if you consult the actual, even like Google the birth rate in the Soviet Union, you can see that it actually went up considerably in the later 1920s and 1930s, partially due to efforts from the state to reward having large families, but also because people tend to have more children when they're in a increasingly secure environment, as the Soviet working class and peasantry started to feel as if they were, and know that they were, in fact, all the way through the later 1930s. And so the birth rate thing is a lie. The idea that there was millions of 55 million deaths due to communist repression alone, again, is completely ridiculous. Even bourgeois sources now will have to admit that the wild numbers published about those killed in the purges of the 1930s were inaccurate. And now we will come to the purges in a later dedicated episode to it, because there's a lot to be said on that needs to be unpacked. But it looks as if the Korganov, according to our correspondent here, was the source of the figures cited by Solzhenitsyn in the second volume of the Gulag Archipelago. Now, his excuse for citing these, even though he said that Solzhenitsyn himself said you can't be totally sure of Kurganov's figures, but we don't have official ones. And of course, nobody ever questioned Solzhenitsyn. Nobody ever questioned a obvious fascist and traitor who should have been fucking shot, to be honest, Kurganov. And of course, as our correspondent correctly points out in her email to me, the ultimate source of all of this is that the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, headed by Goebbels himself, and it was the Goebbels' department who initially put together the wild story about the Soviets causing 54,665,000 deaths by repression, famine, and gulag fatalities, etc. So this is, and again, I thank Svetlana for sending this very interesting piece of information to me. But it confirms what we know about the likes of Kurganov, about the likes of Solzhenitsyn. The fascists, the Russian fascists, white exiles who went and happily joined with the Nazis, as Kurganov did. Solzhenitsyn, it must be said, didn't in the Great Patriotic War. He did fight in the war on the Soviet side, but was engaging in anti-Soviet activity as much as he could whilst continuing to fight in the Red Army at the time. So, what does it tell us about the likes of Kurganov, though? And, of course, Vlasov, the traitor general who went and joined the Nazis, says that these men were prepared, as their ideological ancestors, the white generals, were. They were prepared to see tens of millions of Soviet workers and peasants annihilated annihilated or enslaved and worked to death by the Nazis in return for what? In return that they would get to run Nazi puppet states on the territory of the former Soviet Union. That's the character of all of these anti-communists. All of them. They all go down this route. Now, I know that there are probably some Trotskyites watching this scrambling to find some social democrat who didn't do that. But ultimately, it's, of course, as we've covered comprehensively on this program, and as writers such as Grover Furr and Harpal Bra have covered, this is also true of the Trotskyites themselves, starting with Trotsky. All of these people, especially the likes of Vlasov, Kurganov, Krasnov, and others, were prepared to see the nation they always proclaimed that they loved and that they wanted to embrace and restore to its natural order of things. What the natural order they wanted to restore was the order that saw the slavery imposed upon the peasant and the worker, and themselves elevated to the top. And they were prepared to be the Nazis' cutthroats, the Nazis' strong-arm merchants, the Nazis' slave overseers. And so all of the stuff that is taught, all of the crap that is taught by the Russian nationalists, who aren't, by the way, nationalists, these people are just sort of petty slaves of imperialism, all the way through the Soviet period, all of the anti-communist stuff engaged in by people like Solzhenitsyn, it's all a cover, essentially, for the restoration of bourgeois property relations at any price, at any cost, for the reduction of the Russian proletariat to a status of being a slave of the overseers employed by the West. That is what the likes of Solzhenitsyn stood for. And this is why he was handsomely rewarded for writing his bullshit. And why his books were acclaimed. I've read one of them. I've read A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. I read this 20 years ago, so I'm not going to comment on the literary value of them, because I feel it would be unprofessional of me to give an opinion about something that at the time I remember thinking that I saw some literary value in it. So if you want me to review a Solzhenitsyn book, do let me know. So I'm not going to pass judgments on the literary value of it. I can pass judgment on the literary value of Orwell because I've read one of his recently and he's fucking awful. But the literary value of Solzhenitsyn, or otherwise, put to one side. Others can comment in on the episode if they have read Solzhenitsyn recently and want to render a judgment on whatever artistic value his work had. I will refrain from commenting on the artistic value until I've read one of his works and can bring a better judgment to bear upon it. But with regard to the man's politics, it is absolutely obvious what he was: a gigantic liar, a gigantic fraud, a man who's, I mean, just to digress briefly into like, what does love of nation mean? Just for a moment, what does bourgeois patriotism mean when it comes to, well, any country? What it basically comes down to is a defense of property relations. That's it. You know, the old line from Marx and Engels that workers have no country because you cannot take away from them that which they do not have. The bourgeoisie understand that. Their patriotism, their nationalism is all about defense of private property, defense of their place in the social order. For them, there is no nation that is not defined by that set of property relations. There's no other way to look at it. When you look at the careers of the anti-communists in the Soviet Union in the period of the Great Patriotic War and in the period of the counter-revolution, they all reveal themselves for what they are, which is all about restoration of their social position, their control of the means of production, or at least their social position acting as agents for the imperialists who control the means of production. So that's what Solzhenitsyn and those like him stand for. They are prepared to see the real nation, the nation of the Russian and Soviet peasant and worker. They're prepared to see that nation completely destroyed to restore what they regard as their proper place. And for that reason, you should never take seriously the wild proclamations of these nationalistic figures. The same way you can't take seriously like the wild bullshit of the Ukrainian nationalists, because what have they done? And we will, of course, be returning to their ultimate fate next week when we do the next Decline and Fall episode with our comrade and friend Kit Clarenberg. What are the Ukrainian nationalists stand for? Because they stand for roughly the same things as the likes of Solzhenitsyn. Ultimately, they stand for the reduction of the Ukrainian nation to a bombed-out ruin as long as they can continue stealing from it. That's what they ultimately stand for. And I know that there will be those out there who will start, if there's any Ukrainian fascists watching this, maybe there are, will start weeping and wailing about how the Semites have betrayed them and the Semitic cokehead Zelensky led them astray. But this is where their ideas all ultimately end up. This is where, like, wild, rabid anti-communism ends up. It ends in asset stripping, looting, and destruction, consistently covered up by the wild romanticism, by fantasies about Nordic gods, by fantasies about the wonderful organic life that the wonderful blood and soil ties of the peasants to the land, which is just a cover for the restoration of absolute slavery. In the past, slavery to the landlord, slavery to the boyar, slavery to the kulak. Now it's slavery to agribusiness, slavery to the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. They might not use, well, maybe they do, but the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the various other imperialist entities that have stolen the Ukrainian land and wanted to steal all of the Russian land, they have been thwarted thus far. They might not use the knout anymore, but they have weapons which are just as effective at reducing the Ukrainian and ultimately trying to reduce the Russian agricultural proletariat to abject penury, all covered over by the wild bullshitting of the so-called nationalists. So this is where the fantasies of Solzhenitsyn lead, and it's why he felt comfortable going back to Russia in 1994. Yeltsin's Russia he was absolutely fine with. Probably, maybe a little too many Jews, maybe. But this is the Russia that he wanted, one in which Solzhenitsyn had an acclaimed place within it. It does not speak well of the current Russian leadership that they continue to elevate this absolute fraudster, this absolute liar, this absolute miserable traitor who would have seen the real life blood of the nation, which is the Russian worker and the Russian peasant, again reduced to the status of a slave. So these backward-looking, reactionary, so-called intellectuals need to be exposed for exactly what they are, which is they are people who just want to be want to lord it over the rest of society and paper over their blatant class interests with a lot of bullshit and hogwash about Christianity, about monarchy, and everything else that goes along with it. But this is the nature of the Russian and anti-communist intellectuals, of which Solzhenitsyn is the leading figure. And the reason why he was acclaimed in the West, of course, for so long was precisely because they had his number. They knew that people like that would be willing to sell the Russian nation down the river in return for a few gold coins. And so it proved to be the case. Right. Pausing now for questions, comments, etc. Okay. Right, going up to the top. Hello to President Jesus. It has happened. I know that this, I had to rearrange this because I was held up earlier. So apologies for the slight delay there. So hello to Pavel Linovsky. We'll be covering the Ukraine issue next week. Good day to you all, says YepX. Hope Alex covers the myth that communism killed 100 million people and that communism means that you can't have wealth or personal property. That, I mean, you can debunk that by just looking at the fact that the Soviet proletariat, even in the revisionist period, continued to actually acquire personal property and continued to have their life conditions improved, even in the Brezhnev period. The victims of communism bullshit about communism killing 100 million. Well, they first of all, that figure is made up from fascist and Nazi estimates, or I should say propaganda, but also they include within that all the fascists killed in World War II. I mean, they even admit that they factor in everybody who could conceivably have been killed by a communist. So again, it's nonsense. Like the idea that everybody in communism lives in has to wear an overall and live in penury. Well, again, that simply doesn't work when you compare like the living standards that came about after a revolution and before it. Say the workers and peasants in all of the places where even like the limited revolutions in some of the people's democracies took place, you see the worker and the peasant improve their standard of living enormously. Who loses out? Landowners, capitalists, functionaries of the old regime, which is where the anti-communism comes from. Now, if this sounds like I'm being reductive or crude in any way, like 10 years ago, I'd have been right where you are if you're the hypothetical person raising these objections. But the more you research into it, the more you find that all the anti-communists were these like servants of the ancien regime, fascists, exiled priests, spit, various like dispossessed landlords, dispossessed capitalists, fallen royals. That's who it all comes from. It's the class enemy. Our narrative about communism in the West, the anti-communist narrative, is purely taken from those who lost out in the revolutionary period. And it was fueled later by those exiles who wanted to assume their place at the head of these societies once the counter-revolution had been carried through. Every single time, same thing. Either a fascist or a landlord or a capitalist or all of the above. Right. Hello to Victor, Mo 1917, Vera Olafsdottir, Almir, joining us from the Once and Future Yugoslavia. Juan, Comrade Daniel, who's going on the train back to Bristol. James Goblin joining us also from the Once and Future Yugoslavia. Robert Zvornich, N. Minkowski, who says, I remember, and this is a reference to Solzhenitsyn, reading a memoir of his first wife about psychological torture he subjected her to. The guy was a bona fide psychopath. Indeed, he was. Hello to Boer Hava. Hello to Caustic Grip, who joins us from the working class parts of London, of which there are many, it must be said. Hello to Mutanda, who says Free Palestine. Indeed, indeed. Almir asks, what's this with the so-called multipolar commentators praising Trump for cutting US aid funds? It's just reorganization of the regime change operations, not the end of them. Well, you've answered your own question there. Like, some people have very low standards. Like, some people mistake a basic reorganization. Again, as we were talking about with Kit Clarenberg the other day in the Decline and Fall show, people are mistaking a reorganization of the American state and a withdrawal of funds from two entities like the NED and USA, which are busted flushes now. They're done. Like, everybody who's important in the world, every place that the US wanted to do coups in using the NED and USA, like Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, China, Russia, they all worked out what these organizations were about a long time ago, well, a few years ago now, and acted accordingly. So USAID's been found out. I mean, it's had a 60-year plus run. I mean, in bureaucratic terms, they've done pretty well. And the NED also, similar 40-year plus run, I think. So this is a reorganization. That's all it is. But bear in mind, a lot of the people who are saying this, a lot of the people are coming out with all this shite about, oh my God, it's amazing. You know, Trump's a genius. Well, here's the thing. I would say that these people are too easily impressed. These are the same people who will still weep tears over the corpse of the Kennedys. These are the same people who will get misty-eyed about some fucking useless pro-imperialist social democrat. These are the same people who will tell you that Charles de Gaulle actually got France to leave NATO, which they didn't. They just withdrew from one particular part of the NATO command structure. And tell you that oh, France isn't what it is, isn't what it was, you know, or some other crap, and tell you that Giorgia Meloni is the way forward for Italy, or they'll tell you that the AfD is going to restore the Germany of Willy Brandt or something like that. A lot of these multipolar commentators are just professional myth makers and bullshit artists who are going to tell their audience what they think the audience wants to hear, or perhaps they are lying to themselves and are so invested in lying to themselves they lie to their audience as well. Or maybe there's just professional blowhards like like Sir Scott Ritter. All of the above. And I would say this: don't trust anybody who is currently saying, oh my God, it's wonderful, it's amazing, Tulsi Gabbard's been confirmed as Director of National Intelligence. Anybody who says that and doesn't immediately tell you that Tulsi Gabbard is an active serving military intelligence officer and has been one for many, many years is a fucking liar or a fucking idiot. Probably both. Hello to Agricola Urbanus. Hello to RKB. Joining us from Latvia. First time catching a stream live. Good to have you with us. Hello to Alexander Lukta. Drummond Bass. Alexander Lukta says, what a coincidence that the greatest intellectual of our time, Kermit the Canuck, has a Solzhenitsyn fetish. Yeah, well, yes, indeed. I read Alexander Solzhenitsyn. It was just one of the most emotional things I've ever done since I got hooked on benzos for the first time. Yes, I'm not surprised that he has a Solzhenitsyn fetish because if you haven't worked it out, that's Jordan Peterson I was doing the impression of there. Jordan Peterson is the kind of man who, by his own admission, actually, prefers fairy stories to the real world. That's who Solzhenitsyn's fan base is. Again, like, it may be interesting to critique a Jordan Peterson book or lecture at some stage. Because any man who openly tells you that he prefers Disney fantasies to any other form of art is letting you in on a very dark mentality. So that's a note for me to look at in the future. Greetings to the risen people who join us, and to Nikki and to Even Sten joining us from Scandinavia. Eduardo joins us from Athens. Good to have you with us, comrade. Hello to also, let's see, Robson joining us from Indonesia. Alexander Lukter says, beginning in 2009, Russian schools issued the book as required reading. Russian President Vladimir Putin called the book much needed, while the Russian Ministry of Education said the book showed vital historical and cultural heritage on the course of the 20th century domestic history. Gulag Archipelago is that. Yeah, and there you go. And there again is the limitations of the Russian bourgeois leadership. Like, I made it very clear, all of those of us who support the defeat of the NATO armies in this war in Ukraine have made it clear. We support the Russian state as far as it fights imperialism. But we're under absolutely no illusions about the nature of the Russian state and those within it. These are pro-capitalist leaders. They are, and have been, until quite recently in some cases, rabid anti-communists who back up every single lie Alexander Solzhenitsyn ever told. They've been forced by the circumstances and the hostility of the imperialists to actually lean into the Soviet legacy, because the monarchical fantasies of the likes of Solzhenitsyn, or those two clowns on the Russians with Attitude podcast and the layer that they represent or are part of, the monarchical fantasies don't work in terms of pulling the Russian nation together to face an external threat. You need to lean into the legacies of the USSR, which is why Putin, who began his career as a rabid anti-communist, has had to move more towards a positive view of the Soviet legacy, and why you get people like the Zakharova, who was also rabidly anti-Stalin, having to go out and defend the legacy of the Red Army in World War II. And again, they've found that the rallying point for the Russian population isn't the Tsardom, it isn't the fantasies of the bourgeois, it isn't the fantasies of the Russian compradors, it's the Soviet legacy. That's what they need to lean on industrially and politically in order to win this thing. Right. Yes, Alexander Lutz is quoting some classic choice pieces of Solzhenitsyn there. Okay. Just going through there. Hello to Albert, who says, very strange indeed how the champions of Solzhenitsyn never discuss his last magnum opus, 200 years together, an anti-Semitic piece of Nazi bullshit. Yeah. That's who Solzhenitsyn was. He was a fucking fascist, you know. I mean, there's a few of them in Russia. They're generally compradors, which is what Solzhenitsyn was. And you shouldn't have any illusions about any of these people. Hello to Vitali, who joins us from South Australia. Hello to Davy, who joins us from the land of Wales. Hello to Yuan, joining us from Phoenix, Arizona. Hello to Ian Foster, Comrade Ian Foster, who joins us. Hello to Carter Mann, who says greetings from Seattle. Should I join the ACP? That is very much up to you. I am not an American, and therefore I am not going to advise on what you politically should do as one. What I would say is, go on to the ACP site, read their program, consult their reading list, and make your own decision based on what you see, what the ACP stands for, if you regard the program as a strong one, if you regard it as a communist party which has the potential to go places. I have made my view clear that I think the ACP is a necessary invention. It is a necessary invention because the CPUSA, which seems to have been getting money from USAID, by the way, along with however many other leftist, pet leftist organizations in the US and elsewhere, the CPUSA needed to have a decisive break made with it, which the ACP was part of doing. And it is a positive that you have an openly Marxist-Leninist party which proclaims and defends the legacies of Lenin, Stalin, and Mao out there campaigning in the US. So do your research, read the program, read into the educational program of the ACP, and see if there's an ACP group active in Seattle. I don't know if there is or not. And maybe the best thing for you to do, well, if you're convinced of the program and you're convinced of the need for an American Communist Party, then see if you can contact the local group and talk to them. My point is, do your research and base your decision upon the truth you have gleaned from the facts that you have uncovered. And I will leave my recommendations there. Right, okay, hello to Jessica Fit. Albert says, please review 200 Years Together. Well, you've really fucking sold it to me, so why not? Yes, the people are recommended to read Day in Life of Ivan Denisovich. Vitali says there were comprehensive reviews from the current Russian communists of Solzhenitsyn. They mostly concentrated on his claims, but also touched on the literary value and found it's junk. Well, yes, I will have to go and consult those. I would need to look up some more stuff about Solzhenitsyn from Russian sources. So I'll have a look at anything the KPRF has got. Right. Hello to Jenny, our moderator, who is with us. Hello to Edward. Right, going through the comments here. Alexander Lukta says one of the Russians with attitude is a German speaker. He's not fooling me with that German accent. English. I know that all too well. Interesting. Are they an intelligence operation? Daniel still laugh over Vosh getting US aid. Yeah, well, well, I'm not surprised. I am not surprised in the slightest. I mean, we're getting a little bit off topic here, but all I'll say about Vosh is when a man shows you who he is, take him seriously. That is what I will say about him. Now, I think what we're going to do, just in terms of taking this series forward, is I think I may return to Solzhenitsyn later on in this series because, again, he's an important figure. And I think if you understand the fact that Solzhenitsyn was a straight-up fascist and a comprador, those two things go together very, very well. In the Russian case, and in many cases, in fact. So we may return to look at Solzhenitsyn's work in a later episode. But for the next episode, following on from the world of the nature of Solzhenitsyn, what we will be doing is looking at the anti-communists of World War II, of the Great Patriotic War. So what did anti-communism mean then, and how did the likes of, well, Solzhenitsyn, Vlasov, Krasnov, many of whom were killed justifiably after the war, but the likes of Bandera, the likes of Sheikevich and others, how did they end up becoming so crucial to US anti-communism? So we're going to be doing that next week. TR1001 says, Liberal Chris Hedges cites Solzhenitsyn ad nauseum. I hope Alex addresses his article about teaching Gulag archipelagos to his prison students sometime. Well, I mean, the likes of Hedges, I have no time for. I have no time for Hedges because I think that he's a classic example of like a man who was on the inside, who found that his time on the inside had essentially passed, that he had too much of he objected to the Iraq War, rightly so, fair play, credit where credit is due, but of course approved of the wars on the former Yugoslavia. And his view of the Soviet Union is nothing short of a cartoon. Now, I don't know if Hedges has ever addressed the fact that Solzhenitsyn is a fucking bullshit artist, a fascist, and a comprador. But I would like to see if he's ever said anything about that. I doubt he has. The liberals fucking loved Solzhenitsyn back in the 70s and the 80s. All the liberal and social democratic anti-communists loved him. And they all ignored the fact that he wasn't even hiding the fact that he was a raving fascist. Of course. Nikki Konst says, years after the end of World War II, Solzhenitsyn stated the German army could liberate the Soviet Union from communism, but Hitler was stupid and didn't use that weapon. It also proves that Solzhenitsyn was a bad liar. You know, it's the German army was used pretty comprehensively in the Soviet Union, and it lost. It lost. But again, Solzhenitsyn, like many others, when he was in exile in the United States, he sung for his supper, to use an Americanism. He sung whatever tune that his handlers wanted him to sing. It's the same with the other sort of KGB exiles. The clown that came up with the idea that Soviet intelligence was hoarding compromat on everybody. Like they would say anything that the CIA or MI6 handlers wanted them to say. You want us to say that the Soviet Union has a death ray trained on Ronald Reagan's left ball? Then yes, we will say that the president's ball sack is under threat from a Soviet death ray. You want us to say that that there's actually no one left in the Soviet Union now. It's just Stalin's ghost sitting on a throne of bones. Yeah, we'll say that. What you realize about these people is that they would literally say anything because their entire existence was based upon pleasing their funders inside the US and inside Britain. So whatever ridiculous claim you wanted to make, you could make, because again, no one fact checks them. If you look at the work of Grover Furr, for instance, one of the remarkable things about his work is that he does the job that nobody did on the anti-communist works of so-called history, which is whether it's Kotkin or others, that Grover Furr, controversially, follows the references. So he follows the references to find out where the likes of Stephen Kotkin and others get their information from. And what he finds, because again he's probably the only one who does this, who reviews these books, what you find is that the claims of the rabid anti-communists, like Kotkin, where do they all derive from? Most of them, in fact, a huge number of them, ultimately are sourced from exiled Ukrainian fascists, in some cases, or from, ultimately, people who worked in the intelligence and propaganda operation of the Third Reich, which is what Grover Furr has found going through these anti-communist history books. No one ever fact-checked Robert Conquest. No one ever fact-checked or source-checked Richard Pipes. No one ever checked Trotsky's sources either, come to think of it. And no one checks, other than Grover Furr, checks Kotkin's sources now. Because you can never go out of business as a shit historian and propagandist making wild claims about the Soviet Union. You can say literally anything. You could say that Stalin ate all the grain in Ukraine personally because he won a bet with Molotov. You can say that Stalin actually lived until 1981 as a brain in a jar, directing the economy of the Soviet Union from a bunker under Kiev. You could say that. People would just say, oh, yeah. So it's well known that the Asiatic mind is capable of truly inspiring feats of barbarism, or something like that. This is the nature of things. What we read, the history that we read in the West, is just a carefully constructed cartoon. It has nothing to do with the reality of life in the Soviet Union, the people's democracies, or any communist country. It is a cartoon, and people like Solzhenitsyn are the cartoon characters within it. Right. Nikki Konst says the following. Right. Raw Meathead says, like North Korean defectors these days. Yep. Nikki Konst says he despised the idea of any revolution which in his view annihilated the natural order of life both in France and in Russia, by which he meant the old monarchical regime. Yeah, this is the nature of like anti-communism and just anti-revolutionism, going all the way back to the French Revolution. Like there's been a strain of fascism, or a strain within fascism, which even regrets the bourgeois revolutions. And which reflects like a certain element of bourgeois thought, which is that they hate the fact and try to cover up the fact that they had to come to power themselves through a revolution. They don't like that. They don't like having to deal with it. They don't like because they feel like they uncorked a bottle which they can't put the contents back into again. Once you have a king beheaded and the order that had stood for thousands of years, so supposedly, not really, the myth that had stood for thousands of years, brought down to earth, crashing down to earth, well then one day you fear as a bourgeois that that is going to be you. Once you've beheaded a king, you've torn down the old order, you've disestablished the established church, even if it comes back again, then ultimately you live in fear that that fate will one day be yours, which is why you immediately have a strain of anti-revolutionary thought, even applied to bourgeois revolutions. And by the way, the British ruling class have been done the most comprehensive job on this one. They even tried to say that the revolution which they derived their legitimacy from was, of course, 1689, not 1649, which is, of course, the beheading of a king and the imposition of the bourgeois dictatorship headed by Cromwell. Right. Yes, just Albert's mentioned the Katyn massacre. Grover Furr's also written comprehensively on that. So, yeah, go and check that out. Okay, we are bringing this one to a close for this evening. This brings us to about an hour of dealing with Solzhenitsyn et al. As I said, we'll be dealing with anti-communism as derived from World War II next week. So come and join us again for that one. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in for tonight. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. I will be back again with you next week on the Monday evening. I'm away for this weekend, so there'll be no shows until Monday. But thank you to everybody who's tuned in. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't already. And also be sure to subscribe to the channel. Again, I wish you all a good weekend. I'll be back with you again on Monday. Thank you for tuning in.
Oh, mighty sea, love your bomb to be through Lucy, in the caution till the die. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they're ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has seen, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
전체의 사회 준비를 우리 어떻게 정대로 지키는가를 세계여 보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 국민 백성의 영도 따라서 선군의 붉은 기 그 신념으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 두째의 강성대국을 우리 어떻게 이 땅에 세우는가를 세계여 보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 장군님의 뜻을 받들어 불굴의 정신력 그대 장으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다.
닭사자사